So thank you again for joining another episode of the CoreCommerce webinar. Today's topic is importing option sets explained. What what I'm really going to get into here is a brief overview of what option sets are, because I have done a previous webinar that talks about option sets and personalizations and why you would use one over the other. But this one is going to turn its focus a little more onto the importing of the option sets, because um, over the years I've noticed that the file and importing option sets for the first time versus updating existing ones, um, the file can get a little tricky to understand what it's doing. And so I wanted to do this webinar to just kind of walk through the procedure, and hopefully clear up any confusion anybody may have had about how to use this file. So again, I am Chris Graffinino. I'm the CEO of CoreCommerce. Most of you know who I am. I've been in the e-commerce space since 2003. I've been with this company since 2003 as well, um, which is why I know so much about CoreCommerce. I've been around it its entire existence. So um, that's me. Any questions about that, let me know. But I'll go ahead and get started with the actual presentation. And the first thing I'll do is define what option sets are. Oh, and I see a typo in there, no worries. So option sets are variants, as most of you already know, that you can add into CoreCommerce. You can add them to a product. You can add different questions. Option sets display as drop-down menus, and they're designed more to ask for configuration um, is really the main use for them. So, we talked about in a previous webinar, an option set versus a personalization. And a personalization is good for when you just have like a one-off question you want to ask. Like if you just have a size option, but there is no any other configuration, it's just that one option. Personalizations would work good for that, right? But when you have products that require multiple different things to be configured, and choices affect other choices, meaning not every combination of choices exists. um, the option sets can come in really handy for that scenario. And the most common scenario is going to be a t-shirt or a hat or something like that, where you have to pick a size and you have to pick a color. So as I just mentioned, option sets, you would need them when you want to configure an item that's going to have multiple option choices that may or may not affect each other, um, or not every combination of options is available to the customer to purchase. So you need to make sure that certain combinations of selections are not eligible to be selected. Um, and a good example, as we talked about, is size and color. Here's a screenshot I took of a test product that I created for this webinar. And so what I did is I created a size dropdown and gave it small and medium, and I created a color dropdown, and I believe that I gave it red, blue, and green, if I remember correctly. And the idea being that, I could pick my size, and then it will show me the available color options for that size. So if I pick small, but I want to make sure that you can't pick small and green, I can tell the system, the small green combination is not eligible to be selected. And so what would happen is if I pick small and I open up the color drop down, I would see red and then blue. But if I then change the size to medium, I would see red, blue, and green in the color drop down, because all three combinations for medium are eligible, if that makes sense. And so you can tailor that however you see fit, of course. Um, and that's kind of an overview just of how the option sets get used in the system. So now we'll switch our focus over to importing them. And um, it's all CSV imports, as you guys know. You can use the CSV file to insert new option sets into the database for a product, or to update existing ones. So the screenshot you see on the screen here is just a snippet of what the CSV file looks like. It's the first 9 or so columns of that file. And the first two columns are very important depending on what you want to do. So, the product SKU, of course, is the SKU of the item itself. and then there's the product ID. And on the next screen, we'll start getting into what some of that means. So if you're adding new option sets, the product ID won't exist, right? Because you haven't created them yet. So there won't be anything for you to put in that column, um, and therefore to be blank, so you can omit it. Um, the best way to to really see how this works would be is to go through an item like I did here, create the option sets you want, and then go and export that file and let it give you the file that it exports, which you could turn around right then and there and re-import that same file right back into the database. It change a couple of values and it would update those IDs for you. You could also take that same file and manipulate it just slightly so that you could use it to add new option sets as well. And if you're adding new option sets that don't exist, then the product ID column becomes irrelevant because, again, there is no product ID associated um, with it at this point. So, or in some cases, you probably won't know the product ID unless you've exported all the products out of the database originally. But it's more relatable to you as the merchant running the store to use the SKU versus the ID, because the ID is just a number, has nothing to do with your business. It's just the ID it gave in the database. But knowing that value, if you're exporting and updating the ID, it just in it, you know, and I'll talk about this on the next screen. Um, the ID itself, the product ID itself, ensures that the system's going to update the exact product you're talking about. If you depend on the SKU, as long as every product has its own unique SKU, it won't matter. But I've seen customers that either they don't use SKUs, so all the SKUs are blank in the file. That's the most common issue that happens. Or every now and again, I've seen a customer that happens to use the same SKU for two items. And if you're solely dependent on the SKU for the system to identify which product you want to update, you know, if there's two of them that have the same SKU or they're both blank, it may not know which product to pick, and therefore it doesn't import the way you think it does. So if you use SKUs on all your items, you know, there may not be as much of a need for the product ID itself, but if you don't, the product ID becomes invaluable, especially when updating option sets that already exist. And later on in the file, you know, so those first two columns are to help the system identify which product you're referring to itself. As you go through the file, you'll notice each option is going to be represented by an option group ID and an option ID. The option group ID is essentially the identification number of that combination of choices. So if I chose small and red, that's a combination, right? So that would go in one specific option group ID. And then inside that group, each option within the group has its own ID, which is referred to as the actual option ID of that single option in the database. So if you think of each row in the file as here's this product and here's the specific combination of choices related to this option set of option sets. I think I said that right. So each row is essentially one combination. So you'll notice in my example, if I created small and medium and then three different colors, that means there are what, six, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, six total combinations, right? So what I should see is in my file, six total rows of option sets if it exports, because each combination ends up being its own row tied to that one product. So what you're seeing in that screenshot, I'll explain, is that those are the 5 combinations that make up the option sets that we created on the other screen for that one product that I created. Now, the reason you only see 5 and not 6 is because I turned off small and green. I think I turned off medium and green, to be honest, which is why you only see 2 mediums. So because medium and green was disabled, and I did that manually in the store, it did not export it because it's not eligible to be used. And so when I'm importing it back in, it's not in the file itself, if that makes any sense. And so just to kind of compound on that a little bit, I thought I had one more slide, but I don't. It's okay. So going through this file and the group IDs and the option IDs are going to be used when you're inserting versus updating. So if you're updating existing option sets that you've already created in the database, the system will know what the group ID is. It'll know what the option ID is. It'll have all that in the file you exported. And so you could keep that data in there, and let's say you just wanted to change the word small to like extra small, for example. So all you would do is you'd go into that column AC that you see in that example, and you would literally change all the text from small to X small and re-upload the file as is. And it knows, based on what we're looking at, it knows I need to take the name of option ID 6, which in this case, and you're going to have me update it from small to X small. And that's what it would do there. Now, if you're adding new options, um, then you would have columns where option group ID and option ID, obviously they won't exist because if you haven't created them before, the ID numbers don't exist, right? Unlike the product ID, which would exist because the base product probably exists. But if you're adding options to a product that doesn't exist, these option group and option IDs won't exist. So you would omit those columns and you would just focus on populating all the data across, keeping in mind that each combination is all on one row and it repeats the same few columns for each item in the combination, right? So if you were to keep going over in this file I have here, you would notice that there's option group and then it gets through and then there's another option group ID and then there's another option group ID. If there's 3 items in the combination, or there's 4, then it would repeat itself 4 times across, so far and so forth. And one other piece of advice when doing this is I would separate the tasks of inserting new option sets versus updating option sets. If you're trying to do that in the same file, is going to cause problems because of these 2 columns, the option group ID and the option ID not being in there. It is technically possible, but it gets a lot more, I guess, complex to make sure that the file is right when you're looking at it in Excel. So I've always just kind of kept them separated. And here's, all right, I'm going to export all my option sets I have in my store right now. Okay, I want to update the names on some of these. So I'm going to go through and change all the instances of the word small to extra small, for example. And then I re-import that file without ever touching it. And it will update all those option names for me. And then I can take that same file and delete a couple of columns if I need to, and then just go change some content around. So my assumption being that I'm going to add some new option sets and some new groups that don't exist. And then I get rid of the group columns and the ID columns, change all the option names and values. And when I import that, it's going to add those as new option sets to those items accordingly. And so I'm happy to, if anybody has any follow-up questions about this, like if you're planning on doing an option set import or update anytime soon, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer any questions as far as, am I doing this correctly? Am I thinking about this in the right way? And that's really it. So there's definitely, the file can, because there's so many columns in it, the file can get a little, I guess, overbearing, or it makes you you could get a little overwhelmed looking at it, I think, just because there's so much data in it, especially if you have a store that just has a ton of option sets, which we have some customers that are in that boat. And when they import their file, it might be a few thousand lines long worth of stuff, and so just the more we can help make sure you understand exactly what the file is telling you, the easier it is to kind of make sure that you're confident that updating them is going to work successfully. So with that said, I think that's kind of the end of where I was going to go with this. If you have any other questions, I have time to take a few questions now, or you can feel free to email me as well here. If you have any questions about this or any other webinar or anything in general, or you have any suggestions for webinars you'd like me to do in the future, feel free to email me there. I'm happy to take all of those suggestions